Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Phillip Harman. Phillip is a partner at DAC Beachcroft LLP, a leading global law firm. Now, Phillip advises a wide variety of UK employers upon all aspects of employment law practice, including large-scale reorganisations and executive departures. He's very skilled when it comes to negotiation, industrial regulations and relations, when it comes to managing often challenging situations within the boardroom environment. He also advises upon claims in the employment tribunal side, with particular personal focus on legally complex or highly sensitive claims involving high-level financial or reputational value. Welcome to the show, Phillip.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's a glowing introduction.
Well, you deserve it after a wealth of experience within the legal world, the wonderful world of employment. And I am actually a customer, just putting that out there. I'm a customer. I'm one of your micro customers, I'm sure, in comparison to some of the large multinationals that you deal with. But I wonder, Phil, for those of us who don't know you and firm quite as well as perhaps I do, could you give us a synopsis of how you actually came to be where you are today? And that goes personally and indeed professionally, because I know that you studied a little while ago, or probably feels like a couple of weeks ago to you, at the University of Sheffield, and you also studied Dutch, European and international law, which is quite an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. So my I was originally from Kent, and I, as ever, when you're sort of deciding what degree to apply for, you've no particular idea what you're going to do. I went to Sheffield because my then girlfriend wanted to go to Sheffield, and it seemed like as good a reason as any reason. So that's why I ended up moving up north. And I studied law at Sheffield, but also, as you rightly say, what was then called the Catholic University of Brabant, but it's now the University of Tilburg, which is a university in the Netherlands. And that was genuinely a very intellectually challenging and interesting sort of situation, all about comparative international law. So I was doing things like the differences between French, German, Dutch and English tort law, which is basically things like when you can sue for negligence if you have an accident or something like that. And also things like the difference between English and Dutch criminal law, which is, was fantastically interesting at the time. None of which I've ever used ever since in my day job. So none of that stuff ever happened, was ever useful. Because I'd moved up north, I actually genuinely really, perhaps surprising myself, really loved it. I absolutely really enjoyed being up north. So when I came to look for jobs, I was looking for jobs in the north, and I ended up getting a training contract at a firm in Manchester. This was a firm. It sort of appealed to me because it had an international European alliance that it was involved with, and it was a well-known Manchester firm. But in those days, it was quite small, sort of 30 partners, so large for Manchester, but very small those days. And that's where I trained. And had no particular idea what I wanted to do. I went into employment as a trainee solicitor. At that time, it was regarded as being a bit of a dead end. There were no jobs in this. There wasn't much to do, and I went into it, and I loved it. I ended up the very first case I ever did, a large case, was one which involved individuals being arrested and then being dismissed following their arrest. It had all sorts of it had all sorts of really interesting aspects to it. It involved the law in England, law in Northern Ireland, and that was my sort of like baptism into the world of employment law. And I have to say, I've not looked back. I absolutely loved it. I ended up doing what's called a double seat. So I did a whole year as a trainee solicitor doing employment, and I never looked back. I became a partner back in 2003, and following from that bit, I sort of moved gradually into management, and have managed teams in Leeds, Manchester, and Liverpool. And currently, I manage the team in Manchester.
Fantastic. Wow. So from that baptism of fire, as you say, you never look back. And I guess for those of us who are sitting at home or wherever you might be listening in, is it as exciting as it seems? Because when you talk about it then, and certainly what happened there, you kind of, I'm almost in my mind picturing Suits. And
Well,
it's been glamorized over the late years, and you kind of you think that this is how it actually is, with these fantastic cases going on. It's cloak and dagger, and is it, it's maybe a silly question to ask, but I couldn't help myself. What is it like in real life?
Yes. So when I was a trainee, there was a TV program, This Life, about trainee solicitors and trainee barristers, and everyone assumed it was like that, but it wasn't. It wasn't as quite as outrageous as the TV program. However, speaking as an employment lawyer, it is. I regard myself as being, very, very fortunate. There's a lot of law in it, which is, intellectually really interesting, because employment law changes all the time. My colleagues who do corporate law, for example, and they won't. I'm sure they will acknowledge this themselves. They effectively have to learn one act, the Companies Act, and that's it. It's quite a long act. You learn one thing, you learn it inside out, and that's the basis of what they need to know, plus a few other things. With employment law, there's 1,001 different things. We have law which is based on European law. So things like, the equality and diversity, the Equality Act is partly English law, but partly European law. We have cases which are happening all of the time. So barely a week goes by without some, new case coming out where you're reading it thinking, good grief, that sort of changes what I thought yesterday was the right answer. So I've always loved that side of things, the intellectual challenge. But then the other aspect of it is the people side, because frankly, it's all about people. It's not a dry, dusty aspect of law. It's human. It's about, we're talking about individuals. We're talking about people's real lives. So, when you take a decision which ultimately leads to somebody being dismissed, that means that some poor soul has lost their job, and that's something never to be taken lightly. So it is a very, very interesting thing. I'm fairly rare amongst employment lawyers that I've actually seen both what you might regard the HR side of it as well as the legal side. So by which I mean, I've carried out investigations for clients, I've carried out redundancy exercises for clients, and I think my sort of background is it's a mixture of what the letter of the law. You need to know the law, but you also need to have a sort of commercial application. How do you apply that law to the situation you find yourself in? And an understanding of the people side, the human side, the psychology. I always think that, given that I've had that horrible job of having to sit there in a redundancy exercise and tell some poor soul that they're at risk of redundancy, that until you've actually done that, you don't really know as an employment lawyer what you're talking about when you're advising people on redundancies. You're talking about a situation where you might be legally correct, but it is still a very challenging thing to be saying to somebody who you might like. They may be excellent at their job, that through no fault of their own, their employment's at risk, and the impact that will have on their livelihood. And it's that sort of a human interest side which I find greatly compelling, and hopefully it sort of informs my advice. It's not just about the law; it's about that commercial application, and also about that the psychology, the human interest bit, which informs everything we do.
That is absolutely fascinating, very insightful indeed. And I think you're absolutely right to your point there about this being a real finite balance and almost juxtaposition between the real emotional human psychology piece of it, dealing with, I'm sure, what can often be an emotional roller coaster. For example, if it is dismissal, it's a battle between two forces, but then also looking at the more holistic commercial application, as you say, but being ethical and human at the same time. And I wonder, because I do know from your clients some fantastic testimonials that I've read about from pleased people, clearly, that in terms of the negotiation side and actually dealing with that, what can often be a very complex boardroom environment, lots of different personalities, lots of individuals with significant influence there. And talk to me about how you manage to balance that side of things, you know, the
Yeah.
human, the
It,
emotional, the, you know, all different aspects. Because frankly, I obviously, as you know, deal with a lot of boards a lot of the time, and that is, you know, often the biggest challenge is
yeah.
making sure there is
It,
cohesion between people.
it's a very interesting point because my sort of personal sort of niche tends to be advising at board level, and there's all different permutations to that, but that's effectively what I tend to get involved in. And normally, if someone's approaching somebody like me, it's complicated, it's sensitive. It might be a matter which would be embarrassing if it was in the press. They need somebody they can trust. They need somebody they can have an open conversation with, and they need somebody who can give them a straight answer. And very often it's about risk management. One of the potential challenges you can get is you're talking to people who are, you know, highly successful, highly motivated individuals, alpha males, alpha females. They don't mess about, and they're used to, you know, perhaps getting their own way. I have the advantage of being, you know, I mean, because I'm in private practice, I'm able to come in from the outside, and I'm able to, you know, give it to people straight. That like what I say, that's fine. But actually, usually people find it quite sort of refreshing that they get to sort of, I'm able to give a straight answer. One of the niches I have for is I've advised in the past. I've advised my own firms I've worked for, and I've advised other law firms in the past. And acting for solicitors is a sort of microcosm of the issues you get, because these are typically highly intelligent, very thoughtful people, but with some very dominant personalities, very dominant points of view, and very clear ideas as to they'll very often will approach matters as to, well, this is what I want to achieve. They'll have their objective clearly focused, set out in their mind, and they don't like their lawyers to give them 210 reasons why you can't do what you wanted to achieve. So part of it is to make sure it's a trust thing, it's a relationship thing. I'm definitely of the view people either like you as an employment lawyer or they don't, and can be the personal chemistry. They need to better trust you with the issues that they've got, and but also it's the ability about, you know, effectively giving them a straight answer, a risk managed answer. In employment law, certainly for the UK, normally if normally there's no bar. You can always do things, but the question is about, well, if we do this, the risk is this. It might cost us lots of money. It might provoke lots of PR, adverse PR, and it's all about balancing those things up. One of the curiosities about employment law, I think, and I compare myself to my colleagues who do what you might regard as commercial litigation, so contract disputes, um, is you get an awful lot of emotion in employment matters. So in a commercial dispute, there can be, you know, millions of pounds at stake, but people can be quite detached when they're having their arguments about it. It can be emotive, but people can be a bit more arm's length and detached about how they analyze it. Whereas employment, the people side of it can come to the fore, and even though the sums of money can be fairly modest in comparison, people are less likely to back down. They're more likely to regard it as a matter of principle. They're more likely to say, you know what, I'm prepared to invest the time and money in fighting this one, um, which they wouldn't do if it was a commercial dispute of the same value. There's a much more emotional charge in it. So when you're advising people, it's about having, it's entirely, I think, a relationship um, issue. People have to trust you, and you also have to be able to give a straight answer. I was actually talking to somebody today, and um, what he said to me there was, it was that straight answer that he wanted. He asked me a question, I gave him an answer, and that was what he wanted. And he made the comment because the lawyers he uses for non-employment tend to give him, a legal lecture. I'll spend half an hour, educating this individual about what the law says, and he's a very busy person. He hasn't got time for that. He doesn't, it's jolly interesting and all that, but it's not what he's there for. He wants to say, well, how do I achieve my objectives what's the risk, in terms of if this goes wrong, how bad is it? And it's not just the legal risk, it's the non-legal risk. It's what about the impact upon my colleagues, my staff, what about the impact of my stakeholders, my shareholders? my customers, my suppliers. If this all goes wrong, what's that broader impact going to be? It's not just about, well, you might get a £10,000 tribunal award. I mean, particularly in equality cases, the financial side is almost sort of secondary. In an Equality Act case, an individual can be personally held to be liable. An individual can have a personal award made against them. And I'm sure you can imagine that for that individual, that is usually they are pretty distraught about the idea that a tribunal might disagree with the decisions that they've done. And they might say to them, well, we think you're guilty. You have discriminated against this person, and we're going to make that a public finding. Anybody who Googles your name will find that on record. And we're going to fine you. You have to pay compensation for what you've done. Now that puts an awful lot of psychological pressure on individuals. And I have to say, I don't. The organisations, the people I act for, they haven't deliberately gone out and discriminated against people. These aren't things where people have said, oh, I don't tend to act for ne'er-do-wells who are up to no good. But you do get these cases where they've been perhaps well-meaning, and they've done things and they found themselves, either on the wrong side of the law or certainly arguably on the wrong side of the law. The Equality Act can be pretty complicated stuff. And I know separately we've discussed concepts like unconscious bias, and the Equality Act brings that inside the legal test. It doesn't really matter what you intended to do. It's the impact of what you actually did. Did it discriminate against a person from the perspective of the victim, if you like? And that could mean you do get these cases where people say, well, that in their mind they're completely innocent and they can't believe that they've been. Anyone could suggest otherwise, and it's that's a very challenging position for people to be put in.
Absolutely. And have you, out of curiosity, seen cases where, for example, someone, whether it be a business owner or what have you, has been well intended, but then has had to pay could be a significant amount of money against someone it was the other way around? Because I think, a lot of the time, we talk about, and look, I absolutely am all about people. I'm a D&I practitioner, and, of course, it is all about people. And the last thing you want to do is clearly see people in situations right now that are being furloughed and are losing jobs and everything like that. It's absolute, very, very sad indeed. But I'm also sure there probably is other flip sides to this as well, where it is that the employee perhaps has been the one who's maybe been disingenuous. Have you seen reverse on both cases?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting. It's challenging in the context of equality, though, because there is a sort of natural assumption if somebody makes these allegations in a tribunal, there's a natural assumption where they may or may not be legally right or wrong, but they are being genuine. They genuinely believe their own case. They're not just lying through their teeth. There's a sort of natural assumption, and it's quite difficult to persuade people that people are lying, or because that's really what you're saying. And as a matter of social policy, there's a general policy in the UK that people are entitled to have their day in court. They're entitled to, certainly for things like equality law, they're entitled to argue these points. These are serious matters, and they may not, but they may be wrong. They may be mistaken. But they're entitled to their day in court, and there shouldn't be any adverse consequences for the individual. So it's quite rare that you get costs awarded against employees for pursuing a genuinely believed claim, but it does happen. I mean, I mentioned before that sort of like huge case I acted for when I first started out. Well, that involved the individual basically deciding, well, my case needs a bit of a boost. So he was making up a few documents in order to improve his case. That was a discrimination case. And, he had letters, and the letters didn't quite, make his points as well as he liked them. So he basically, cut a few paragraphs out of that letter, rearranged the paragraphs, photocopied it, produced new letter. New letter looked far more convincing. So that's what he put in his bundle of documents and in support of his case. Now that
It's like
came out.
detective work, isn't it? I mean, it's
Oh, I know,
absolutely fascinating.
absolutely.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall
That
in your
came out. That was
world.
because that letter. You know, we were. I remember reading that letter, thinking, oh dear. Did is this right? Did we really say this? This doesn't sound very good. And then I'm discussing it with the client, and the client goes, yeah, but no, but it doesn't seem like that's right, because the language was, it just read like, in terms of an English language point of view, it was very clumsy use of language, didn't quite flow. So we were able to track down the author, and we spoke to that author, and we sent him a copy of this letter, and he just said, I never, that's not my letter, and sent us a correct copy of the letter he had sent. And that's how it came out that the paragraphs had all been chopped and changed, and one sort of dodgy paragraph had been deleted. But yes, there's always a bit of um, part of my sort of view on employment law is it's about that there's an awful lot of innovation in it, in the sense of coming up with a practical way to achieve an impossible problem. You get these situations sometimes where there's literally no textbook answer. It's a log jam, and you're saying, well, if I was to follow the textbook, we'd all end up in court. And then if we all end up in court, basically it's good for the lawyers, we all make lots of money, but for everybody else, it's bad news. For the employee, they have the stress of the court case, it probably costs them a lot of money. For the company, they have the stress of the court case, they have all their managers out for a week, costs them a lot of money. So apart from, the lawyers are all jolly happy, but that's not necessarily a win situation. So part of it is about coming up with creative answers to say, well, how on earth can we get through all this so that we have a solution where everyone backs down and everyone can live with this solution, and it can work. Um, and you often get this where you might have sort of regulatory type issues, where it's not just employment, it's things like, well, there's broader issues here. How do we deal with this without it being a fiasco where we're all suing each other? And I find that's also a genuinely interesting thing, that you can actually analyze a problem and say, okay, well, here's a potential way through all of this, where we all back down a bit, and there's an achievable solution to this, which, where it's not a complete fiasco. But it's very, very hard. And another very recent one where I was saying I was acting for the company. The employee it was a whistleblowing case. That's this one. So similar-ish in a sense to equality, but a different sort of thing. So they were asserting, I've blown the whistle about A, B, and C, and I think you're picking on me because of the fact I blew the whistle. I had said from day one, this is just not a very good case. You might genuinely believe this, but it doesn't hit the legal test. And very sorry about that. It doesn't hit the legal test. But it was the emotion in that case was they were not prepared to back down until they were mid-tribunal. So it was a 1 week tribunal case, and we were mid-tribunal, and that was when the individual concerned, the case just collapsed like a pack of cards, and at that point, they basically withdrew. And what was interesting to me there was that individual, they genuinely believed their case, and that's fine, that's a matter for them. But their lawyer hadn't really given them to it straight. The lawyer hadn't said to them, well, I have a lot of sympathy for you here, but actually your case is not very good from a legal perspective. You might lose this. In fact, you will probably lose this. They hadn't had that straight conversation. It was a very curious thing for me. There's nothing, from my perspective, there's nothing worse than going and losing a case. The last thing you want to do is to give a client, false expectations that this is a shoe-in and it's in the bag. You need to be straight with people. If the client then says, well, this is a 10% chance of success, and the client says, I don't care, run it anyway. I have clients who sometimes do that. From my perspective, great, let's go for it. But you need to be straight with two people so they know what the score is.
Absolutely. It's that honesty and transparency. And what is absolutely curious about everything that you're saying, thank you for sharing those examples there. I'm sure many people are kind of thinking and looking within their organizations thinking, oh yeah, I remember something like that. But I wanted to draw upon a couple of things that you say there, because this really is, as a great employment law, I really think it is an art and a science combined. You cannot have one or the other. It's that finite balance, isn't it, between being empathetic and being understanding, yet also being open and honest and transparent and ethical, because ultimately could end up going all the way down to the end for a very, very long time, as you say, charging a lot of money. But ultimately, is it going to have the desired outcome
Absolutely, yes.
for the client? Indeed. But you mentioned there, and this is something that I've observed in many a boardroom and many a leader that I have spoken to, those that genuinely I would call the most inspirational and those that have the biggest buy-in in terms of their team are those that really have got it nailed when it comes to that trust, the relationship building capacity, the empathy, and most importantly, overriding all of that is the emotional intelligence. And what's interesting, if I kind of look back at almost your archetypal leaders, you're beating on the kind of drum chest, kind of standing on tables, booming that they are the CEO or whatever. Those CEOs, those leaders of today, and I think of the future as well, because I do think intergenerationally and millennials will start to demand this, is the transparency, almost the vulnerability and the emotional intelligence of leaders. And that is absolutely what you've kind of encapsulated in everything that you have said there, is having that balance, being able to almost be, essentially you're like a legal professional, but also counselor. It's I almost compare, and I do this within the world of exec search as well. Is it's like you're managing, almost it could be like a divorce situation, and you are the counsellor in the middle.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's very interesting to hear you say that. I do actually use the expression. This is an art, not a science. It's you need to know the rules. You need to know the legal rules. Otherwise, if you don't know the rules, you're just basically guessing. You're a bluffer, and I have no time for that sort of thing. So you need to know the legal rules. But actually, it's how you apply those legal rules to any given situation, which is the art. And that really comes through sort of experience, and you sort of see that when you see people who are good at it, you say yes, they're very sure-footed. And when it comes to sort of leadership, I know in my own, I've seen it with clients, but I've also seen it in my own personal career. You come across people who are absolutely fabulous as leaders, and they have exactly the same sort of in terms of this, in terms of the stuff that's given to them. They all have the same sort of stuff that's given to them, the same support, the same sort of budgets and all this kind of stuff. But some people, are genuinely impressive leaders, and you can see the impact it has on teams. We often talk about in law firms discretionary effort, which is this idea of people just going, old-fashioned, going above and beyond the call of duty. And when I've seen that, at play, it's amazing. People do you favors without question. They don't, without hesitation. I've always and it's at all different levels. I've always given the example that we won a brand new client and the person who was key in winning this client was the secretary in the team. She answered the call. It was an urgent matter, and she was about to go home. And she works part-time, and she made it her business to make sure that whatever I did, I phoned this person up. She was on the bus phoning me, Philip, phone this person up. You must do it. And some people wouldn't bother. Some people would say, well, it's not enough time. You can do it tomorrow. And they would have just walked away, but she didn't. And that was her personal pride, professionalism. And we won the brand new client. We pinched that client off a competitor. And that was all to do with that individual's discretionary effort. Now, and when you achieve that, it's priceless, that sort of thing. And a lot of that is how people, their view of you, whether they respect you as a leader, and because the opposite is, if they don't, you literally they say, well, I'm here to earn my salary, my wages, and come 5 o'clock, I'm out the door, and I don't care. They might be perfectly, polite, but they don't have that sort of buy-in. And the difference that makes in terms of the day job and actually doing what you do, plus and also the culture, the actual climate you work in, is huge. It's a huge difference. And that sort of cultural side is incredibly important. We all spend so much time at work if you work in an environment where you actually say, you know what, I actually quite like my colleagues. They're good people to work for. They're people who I would go out on a limb for. They would go out on a limb for me. It makes such a huge difference compared to working in an environment where you're thinking, God, my boss is a bit of an idiot, and he probably thinks I'm an idiot, and it's all very scratchy, and we all do the bare minimum we have to in order to get paid. So that sort of that side of and leadership makes a huge difference. When you get a change of leadership, you often see that sort of cultural crunch where it just suddenly comes to an end. Or
I absolutely concur. And just a brief one on going above and beyond. I must mention here one of your team, Richard Kay.
oh yes,
Absolutely fantastic guy, Richard. So small shout out there, because actually he, and I think that's, it is cultural. Clearly it runs within the firm, which is fantastic. It is relationship driven. You're absolutely right when you say that it's all about trust, goes within any organization, within any sector. If the trust is not there, it's very, very, very difficult to do business, and very difficult indeed, but certainly more so in the case of employment law, because you are dealing with such personal matters that can have huge old implications. But indeed, going above and beyond is absolutely critical. And I wonder as well, obviously you've had a lot of board experience dealing with various different characters, and also internationally as well, because obviously you are an international firm. I wonder, from your perception, and certainly over the years, how important for you as a watcher or a bystander almost is having an inclusive board. And I say that for not only within the organisation, but also for those that you have perhaps observed quite contentious boardrooms in the past. How important is that inclusive board?
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting because you can see the difference. You can there in a board which is well balanced, has good governance, has a broad range of perspectives. Just as a general observation, is a far more impressive, functional, and also imaginative, atmosphere to work in. And you can never generalize too much about these things, but just as that's my own personal observation, when you see these things, it's very, very impressive where you get well-structured organizations. To be fair, it is a challenge. It's a challenge to law firms because, frankly, law firms, we are all a bit like me, a bit white, male, middle age. And things are changing. So over my career, things have changed very, very dramatically. And I have to say, this is one of the most diverse firms I personally have worked at. It's very impressive in terms of the activities it undertakes and the breadth of the lawyers we attract. But it has traditionally been a challenge. But the difference it does make is it does give you, it does shake things up greatly in a very positive way. It's a bit like you get this sort of reinforcement culture. If we're all like me and my chums from school, we'll just all be doing the same thing, and we do the same thing for another 50 years. And that's not a good idea. What you want is to people who can come to you and say, hey, but Philip, that's jolly interesting. But have you ever thought about this? This is a much better way, or this is a different way of doing it. Broaden your horizons, open you up to ideas, understandings, new targets, new clients, and so that if you like is just the sort of the hard-nosed business reasons why it's a good idea. Is actually also just like a delightful way to operate from a sort of personal perspective. We are very sort of in these days, when I started, being a lawyer was there was no such thing as working from home or working from part-time working. No such thing. Whereas now, actually, it's all a patchwork of people working with with different sort of commitments. We aim to, we aim to attract people from all sorts of different backgrounds. I because I feel that I personally have been very privileged in my own sort of journey through life. I have to say, that translates in itself is I was very lucky to have been supported by people when I was sort of a junior lawyer, and I've always done what I can to support, aspiring, young, dynamic, junior, individuals who are starting out on their career, particularly when they don't have the benefits I had. If you don't come from a sort of a background where your father's a lawyer, and actually my father wasn't a lawyer, my father was a builder, but you don't come from a background where you're, you can talk about, well, my father's a lawyer, etc. How do you start? How do you get to know anybody? How do you network with people you need to know to be a lawyer? And actually, so what I do is I make sure I always take people to these things. I take people to things. I introduce people to things. I do what I can to share my contacts and share my sort of experience and theories and all that side of things, so people are have the oxygen and the support, and then you sort of build that into what they bring to the mix, and it works really well. It is that difference, which, as I say, it's not only from a hard-nosed business point of view, shakes things up and actually gives you a bit of an edge, but it's also just a really lovely way to work. It's a very pleasant, socially liberal, appeals to me greatly way to work.
Philip, I absolutely love how you've described that, and so articulately as well. Actually, that is a real, and I didn't realize your father was a builder. Thank you
Oh,
for
yeah.
sharing. That's absolutely brilliant, because what it is though, and again, before I don't want to kind of go on forever, because I know we are short on time, but look, diversity and inclusion, belonging, what you described there, it's ultimately, we don't want groupthink. If everyone is the same as us, how are we ever going to breed innovation? Having that eclectic mix of thoughts and diversity, and that, even neurodiversity around the table, is ultimately what is going to breed a better business case, because the world these days is very multicultural. We want to represent our customers and everything like that. But as you so wonderfully put it, it is a delightful way to work. Different people, different experiences. I just love how you say that. But really, what you have epitomized is a fantastic example of social mobility, and something which actually, I wish was talked about far more: social mobility and some of the invisible diversity. So whilst I am a massive fan of diversity by way of physical diversity, whether it be ethnicity, gender, race, religion, etc., etc., but also there's so many different wonderful invisible diversities, be it, well, I say wonderful, but things that make us neurodiverse and different, mental health, social mobility, coming from a background which, whilst your father, and forgive me, I don't know, could have been the owner of multi-billion building companies when you say a builder. So I'm not sure, but ultimately, to me, it sounds very much like, a real kind of, working class, middle class man. Forgive any stereotypes there, but actually, you really have demonstrated ultimately what is social mobility, and would you know that from the surface if you weren't to then have the conversation and scratch below the surface? Now, and I think there is a lot of emphasis placed on D&I visibly, which is great, because representation is important. We represent our customers, we represent our firms, but invisible diversity and scratching below the surface is also absolutely critically important.
Absolutely. My father generation was very, very poor, and so he was somebody who pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He minimal education, but he worked very hard. I would say I was very fortunate. So I won't pretend to, I won't pretend I'm from the wrong side of the tracks. I definitely was born with a silver spoon in my mouth by the time I was born, but my father wasn't. He was born from a very poor generation. But yes, but actually the social mobility thing is genuinely really, really interesting. We do a lot of, in terms of our own internal recruitment exercises, we do a lot of activity to try and broaden it. Again, for lawyers, there's an awful lot of private school lawyers as a percentage. It's quite an interesting sort of thing where you get these sort of ongoing themes. And it's, how do you break through that? How do you get some of the talent up from some of these state schools, particularly where they may not have, they may be state schools which are not necessarily the best performing in the region. They may be ones where you have individuals who are struggling, and these will be people very often who do not have do not have access to any of the normal networks or in the networks I would have had in terms of bringing forward their career.
And that's it. The power of the network is absolutely fundamental. And I think you're absolutely right. It's times like this, you look back and reflect and think, wow, hang on a minute, until you actually sometimes get further in your career, do not realize, and certainly myself as well. My mum in the NHS and father worked for an entrepreneur, and actually, I'll ask them about businesses. Well, how much would we know about the world of business and this kind of thing? My father perhaps, but again, contacts were over the significant pond, actually, over perhaps in Hong Kong, up in his early years in London. But actually, if you don't have that existing network, and you don't have, as you alluded to earlier in the conversation, oh, my father's a lawyer, my mother's a lawyer, etc., sometimes quite hard to almost get that credibility because of be it unconscious bias or whatever, that says you belong in that circle.
Yeah.
But just before we go, Phillip, I'm conscious of timing here, and I'm dying to ask you a couple of lightning round questions. You only have 30 seconds, mind you, to answer each one. So I'm going to give you a couple here before we very quickly summarise. But first of all, hardest question first, perhaps. What has been your secret to success?
That's a very good question. I think it's I'm just passionate about what I do. I genuinely love my job. I describe myself as being a zealot when it comes to employment law. I am so I love what I do. I regard myself as being very fortunate to be doing what I'm doing. And I'm one of these annoying people who get up in the morning, you say, let's get to work. I love this. And basically that's been my attitude for, well, gosh, what is it? Something like 25 years of being an employment lawyer.
Very good. And so the partners of the firm are going to be listening and going, oh God, here he comes, bouncing into the office again, or the virtual office at the moment.
I actually think they think, oh my goodness me, here he is again. Yep, you're quite right. Yeah.
And what does diversity and inclusion mean to you personally?
Well, I think it's like, for me, it's I feel that it's been a personal journey for myself, because the world of business has moved on so greatly since I first started. But for me, it's all about working with a team of people, as I am currently doing, who reflect all sorts of different backgrounds, different sexual orientations, reflect basically the UK as it is now. And it means so much to me. There's no question, as a lawyer, as a legal advisor, my advice is better because I work in an environment where I'm talking to colleagues who actually know what it is to be discriminated against, and they actually can understand what these issues are, what these things mean, in a way where I can understand it at an academic level. I can have empathy, but I wouldn't necessarily experienced it myself. And so that's such an important aspect of what we do, that we work in a team which is a very, I would say, it's a very culturally diverse team. It's as I say, it's a mixed team in literally every way you can possibly imagine. We represent everybody. I think me and Richard are the two white males on the team, basically, and everybody else we are the so we're not your stereotypical law
the token white team. Men, are you?
You're probably right. You're probably right.
And finally, 30 seconds, remember.
Oh gosh, right.
Finally, if you were to go back in time and to give the young Phillip advice back when perhaps you didn't know what you were going to end up doing, or indeed to someone else who perhaps was in that situation, where they're about to embark on a career and they're really not quite sure what they may do next, what would you say to the young Phillip?
So no question. My lesson in life, and I say this to my juniors, is that don't accept no. You're in life and work, you're surrounded by people who give you 101 reasons why something's impossible, or you can't do it, or it's too much trouble. It's all rubbish. You press on regardless. It is amazing how often it works. It can be a bit annoying for some people, but nobody apologizes. Nobody tells you off when you're successful. It was the advice it was from the CEO of MTV Europe, where it was just like, you can listen to the naysayers and it will put you off, and you'll sit in the back room and you'll achieve, it will hinder what you achieve. Don't, if you have a good idea, do it, go for it. I had a bit of a Rubicon moment in my sort of career where I sort of got that as a point. And since then, it's worked really, really well for me. And I thought, I don't know why I didn't do this earlier.
That is such brilliant advice. Don't take no for an answer. I try and follow that every single day, actually. So it resonates a lot with me. But thank you very, very much indeed, Phillip, for being here today. You've been an absolute joy, and great sense of humour as well, which I absolutely love. And I think there's certainly been a huge amount of a huge amount of takeaways and learning points from the podcast today. Certainly not taking no for an answer and having that huge amount of resilience, but also, we really can do good in society and business. And I think, what you have demonstrated there is that very, very interesting juxtaposition, as we've said, between the art of business and kind of science, or the art of the science, and the art together within the world of employment law, and ultimately how other businesses and other leaders can try and harness some of these skills, which, frankly, sound very, very much like they are underpinned, should I say, around emotional intelligence, relationships, and integrity. Ultimately, they sound very simple, but I think there's many organisations that perhaps don't do quite as they say. And I think you are a great testament to that, and some very, very good advice there indeed. So really resonated with me, and thank you very, very much again for being here today.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Okay.
My name is Leila Mackenzie-Dallas, and you've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast, brought to you by Dial Global. You can visit us at www.dialglobal.org/podcast. You can also visit our COVID-19 support hub, which is entirely free at the moment during these unprecedented times. Thank you very much again to the fantastic Phillip from DAC Beachcroft, who's joined us today and talked about some insightful things. If you've missed anything at all, you want further information or links to Phillip, don't worry. If you've not written it down, we can put all of that, and we will put all of that into our show notes at the end of today's show, so you can check out all of the key learning points, the information, and links to be able to get in touch. Thank you very much, and see you next week. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.